This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of September 11th, 2023. And, as I went back over the last couple of weeks of Solid Signal blog posts for inspiration for this podcast, it occurred to me that this is going to be the kind of podcast that may not have an overarching theme. There's just a bunch of little things to consider this week. And so let's kind of get into it. I don't know how long this podcast is going to end up being. Could be one of the shorter ones, or I just could find something to ramble about. You know how I go about that. First of all, as I'm recording this, it's Monday, and so I can't let the day go by without at least mentioning the date, September 11th, 2023. It's interesting to me that we now have about a generation and a half of folks who really don't have a connection to that date because they were too young or weren't born yet when it happened. Of course, that's going to go on. In my youth, there were a lot of people who were very reverent about December 7th, and yet I personally had no connection to it. And so, it's the circle of life, I guess. But we can look at the legacy of September 11th in a lot of ways, a lot of good ways and a lot of bad ways. But I prefer to think of it this way. September 11th, 2001, going into the 12th and the 13th, what I really remember of those days was a spirit of coming together and caring, reaching out to people who you hadn't heard from in a while and seeing how they were getting on, and talking to people who maybe had friends or relatives who passed away, and of which I did, and seeing how they were holding up. I didn't have a lot of direct connections. It was more like a secondary friend of a friend kind of a thing. But, it was still people that I knew, and other people felt it more acutely. But how everybody just kind of came together and was really just peaceful for a little while. Maybe it didn't last, but that's one thing that I really would like to recall about those days. Second thing that I want to do is congratulate Ana Gomez. In a surprisingly quiet event on Thursday evening, the Senate confirmed the fifth FCC commissioner, Ana Gomez. And I think that she starts immediately. I don't think she needs to be sworn in or anything. And then she kind of hits the ground running, even though the FCC's website isn't really saying a lot about that. I'm not sure how it works. Not important. If you want a more deep dive about my feelings about that, go to the Solid Signal blog, blog.solidsignal.com, and you'll find an article about it. I'll just say that the confirmation process, regardless of why it happened, regardless of getting into the politics, which I try not to do on this podcast, it should never have gone 2.5 years without confirming a relatively routine appointment. And that's not how things are supposed to work. The government is supposed to actually function and not be held back. And I'm not, like I said, I don't want to get too far into the blame game, but let us hope that in the future that we can find ways of working together where the people who are put up for jobs are people who could be confirmed to them. The people who confirm the candidates are actually willing to do that work. And so we can all get back to it. There's a lot of work for the FCC to do, not the least of which is the fact that I got about 12 spam texts yesterday alone, and I'm not super thrilled about that. The spammer industry is still as strong as it ever was. And by the way, if you're curious about how some of that started and how it kind of mutated, there's a documentary on HBO called Telemarketers. You'll also find it on the Max app. It kind of peters out toward the end, but the first 2 episodes of the 3 that air are actually pretty good, and I urge you to take a look at them. I'd also like to congratulate the folks at Google for a largely uneventful rollout of the Sunday Ticket this past weekend. I know that it didn't go perfect, but for the most part, the issues had to do with the local carriers, not with Google itself. And that's been to some extent true in the past too, because you have these big data centers that are providing this content, but the local network switches get overloaded. That happened yesterday. It happens every year, and it gets better. It does. But in the meantime, I have to give credit where credit is due to the fine folks at Google who did a ton of work to get this all ready for this weekend. And also to the folks at DirecTV who got it ready for the bars and restaurants that aired Sunday Ticket yesterday. I'd like to finally, before I kind of get into the meat and potatoes of this podcast, I'd like to sort of answer a question that came out on, it actually came through our Solid Signal mail apparatus over the weekend. The question was, why can't I see the Sunday Ticket channels? Because they are in the 9,000s on DirecTV, but consumers could not see them. Well, you can't see them because you can't get them. And DirecTV has always had a facility for hiding channels. I mean, think about it. If they didn't, then you wouldn't have been able to get really local television, because you'd just be your guide would have 200 channel 4s on it, and you wouldn't know which one was which. Well, I think DirecTV wisely chose to hide the channels in the 9,000s. There are tons of other channels that have been out there in the 9,000s. That area is reserved for private networks. So that just because it's not in the guide doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And yes, it's true that a lot of residential customers can't see them. But like I said, you can't tune into them if you're a residential customer. So it doesn't really matter. I think the folks who are curious about that are largely curious because they've been monitoring some of the fine work done by the folks at Satellite Guys who monitor the satellite feeds and talk about what channels are on what satellite. Shout out to Gary and Jimmy and Tom and the great folks, the great work that's being done there. Now, the big thing I really want to talk about this week is that there's a whole lot of nothing to watch. I would have really guessed that the ongoing writers and actors strikes would have ended by now, with the fall season, usually hits its stride about the third week of September, and a lot of this stuff tends to get resolved at least by the time that football begins to air. But we are seeing more channels blacked out than ever, led, of course, by the fact that Nexstar Media Group has forced DirecTV to black out well over 200 stations, and that all the folks who are getting Spectrum are now unable to get ESPN or any ABC or Disney content. All of this is due to the content providers. Don't let their websites fool you. They have demanded that the pay TV companies take down their content, and especially in the case of DirecTV, they have publicly come out and said they would be willing to extend any existing contracts, do whatever was necessary to continue serving the customers, and yet it's the media groups, the content providers, who are saying no to that. This whole thing seems like it's very different from channel blackouts of past years, because everybody's digging in their heels. Everybody. The writers are digging in their heels. The actors are digging in their heels. The content providers and the satellite and pay TV companies are digging in their heels. Everybody has this feeling as if this is the last stand against some sort of injustice. And depending on who you are, really depends on what you think that injustice is. I don't tend to take partisan points of view on this podcast whenever possible, so I'm not going to get into what I think it is. But here's the bottom line, is that everybody is dug in so deep that they are sabotaging themselves to a person. I'm not blaming one group as opposed to another. I would just say at this point, what's happening, folks, is that nobody is watching live TV on certain channels because they can't see it. Ratings are suffering. The future of movie and television scripts is in danger. The production schedule for the next 2 years is in danger. And there are a lot of people, thousands and thousands of people, who are affected by this, who are not part of the striking unions, and whose livelihoods are being affected. I understand that these are incredibly important issues on all sides, and I recognize that each person, each company has a right to dig in where necessary to say we will go this far and no further. That's important. That's something that they should do when it's necessary to do it. But come on, folks, go to the table. There have been so many reports about how there is no negotiating going on. Sides won't come to the table. They won't start to talk because they feel like they have nothing to talk about. Well, I just don't believe it. We're all one big media consuming country here. We may disagree on a lot of things, but who doesn't want to watch something on TV or in the movies? We all do. We all want it. And you know what? When it comes right down to it, I think that the overarching majority of folks are in favor of honesty and fairness when it comes to getting paid for things. And I'm not going to go ahead and define that in terms of like micromanaging it, but I think that we all agree that everything should be at least as fair as it could be, and know that it's never going to be perfect, but everybody can get a little bit of something. So I would just say, on my extremely small soapbox, I know that I really only have about 1,000 of you who listen. If anybody who is out there who just happens to be able to affect any meaningful change, I would just say, come to the table. Let's find a compromise that ends these long-standing conflicts in a way that's as fair as possible and takes into mind that we all have a mutual responsibility to our customers, the listeners and watchers and consumers of media in this country, who want to see that stuff out there, who don't want to have empty screens and reruns, etc. So please, let's move forward. I don't want to do another podcast like this. I don't like it any more than you do. And so please, I urge everyone to come forward in a way that makes some degree of sense. That's about it for the Solid Signal podcast for this week. I hope that you take a moment, like, subscribe, and it's never been more important than ever, or than today, that to comment, because, you know, there's some controversial stuff that I'm talking about. Liking and subscribing makes me look good to my bosses, and that is always appreciated. Do me a favor, of course, shop at solidsignal.com and also go to signalconnect.com. Learn about the great services that are available there. These are the folks who keep the lights on here at the Solid Signal podcast. I am incredibly grateful to them, and I hope to give them the benefit of a little bit of advertising without hurting the podcast and making it sound like one big commercial too many times. That's about it for this week. I hope you have a great one, and I will talk to you again real soon.